Welcome everybody to another Developer Livecast here on the Game Wisdom channel. I am joined tonight by the owner and lead designer of Kitfox Games, Tanya Short, and she's here to discuss kind of what the studio's been up to, as well as their upcoming game, Boyfriend Dungeon. How are you doing, Tanya?
I'm great. It's the end of a work day, but it's just Monday, so I still have some weekend energy left.
That's good. I need to get back into the swing of things as soon as we're done here. I got casts and videos to start editing, but it is certainly a busy time for everyone around.
Yeah, that's the end of the year.
So, for longtime fans of Game Wisdom, Tanya and I, we've spoken on several recorded casts. I think it's been like, what, 2 to 3 years since our last little discussion, so
Yeah.
it certainly has been a very long time. But, since this is your first time on for one of these live casts, Tanya, if you wouldn't mind, can you talk a little bit about who you are and what is Kitfox Games?
Sure. So we started Kitfox Games 5 years ago. I had just left a job at a big MMO company, working as a scripter and AI designer and narrative designer. And we started Kitfox together in 2013, and we released a few different games. Shattered Planet was our first in 2014, and then we released Moon Hunters on PC and all the consoles from 2016, 2017. And then we released The Shrouded Isle last year. I believe you talked to John Woo, the lead designer for that one. And we announced Boyfriend Dungeon a couple months after Shrouded Isle, so a little bit over a year ago. And we've been working on it now for, oh my goodness, I can't believe it's almost been 2 years soon, basically. It's crazy how time goes. But
I know.
yeah, we did a Kickstarter in the fall, and that went really well, so we're trying to make it the best game we can now.
And I know certainly about how time flies here. It seems like time has no meaning when we start having these game design discussions.
Some things are timeless.
But, like you said, Kitfox Games has been around for a while. I think the last time we spoke, I think this was right around the time Moon Hunters came out. And then, like you said, I spoke with the lead designer of Shattered Isle. And I guess here's my first question for you, Tanya. It's one that I like to ask a lot of independent studios, especially those that have been around for a few years. When you look at Kitfox Games' catalog, you have a very diverse offering of titles in terms of design and implementation. And there was this push, or there was this thought process about like 5-6 years ago about how do you define or brand yourself as an independent company. So I wanted to ask you, like, in your opinion, when it comes to Kitfox Games, like, how would you, like, I guess, put a stamp on what kind of games Kitfox likes to make?
Well, when we first started, well, basically right as we'd finished Shattered Planet and we were going around asking investors for money, we decided that like procedural generation was something that we really were interested in, and accessible, like pick up and play, yet easy to learn, hard to master kind of thing. Accessible depth is what we called it. And then we had one other pillar, I forget what it was. Oh yeah, cross-platform. So being able to make games that work on a variety of different systems. But all of that is very investor-oriented, and although a lot of it is still true and based on things that we're interested in, I don't think that ends up being what people would, like, it's not special enough to say what is unique about Kitfox, because a lot of different companies are making games that are slightly different every time, or games that are, accessible depth is most designers want some kind of depth that other humans can understand. I do think that we end up having an interesting balance between mechanical systems and narrative systems. I think there aren't many games out there like ours that have, well, I mean, there are many. There are many, many, many games of every kind out there, actually. But I think one of the things that ties a lot of our games designs together, that is unusual, at least, is the fact that it tries to be different every time, and yet also have systems that are narrative supported or narrative oriented.
And you can definitely see that in the Shatter Isle, especially, with how much the narrative basically implies or really focuses the gameplay as you're trying to make decisions about who to sacrifice, what people to reach out to, things along those lines. And it's very interesting, again, as we see a lot of independent studios, not just Kitfox, have really grown into their own over this past decade in terms of not just exploring things from a narrative and gameplay point of view, but trying to define themselves, and putting their own unique spin on game design.
And it's hard because as a designer, I think a lot of us are very novelty focused anyway, so it can seem at first like you're just doing a bunch of random different things. And it's only in retrospect when you look back at your different projects that you see, oh, I do have an abiding interest in this particular set of problems, or I am genuinely interested in this kind of system, and I've revisited that multiple times. And so, like, narrative generation is clearly something that I'm interested in, but I approach and then I back off again, and then I approach in a different way and then I back off again. And Boyfriend Dungeon is a good example of something that we decided to not generate almost anything, actually, about the narrative. It's kind of up to the player to choose. It's non-linear, but it's in some ways less generative than any of our other projects.
And we will certainly be talking about Boyfriend Dungeon in the coming minutes. So, I guess... I
didn't mean to jump ahead.
Oh, no, that's all right. But as kind of like a quick tangent then, as you said, a lot of designers tend to focus on like specific designs, especially some that they like. I guess for you, Tanya, what are some of like the game designs or just kinds of games that you like to play?
Oh, it's always a balance of different kinds of games. Right now, I'm very interested in the Obra Dinn. The Return of the Obra Dinn is fantastic as an interesting system-driven narrative for sure, and I'm kind of obsessed with it. So I don't know if I'll be able to 100% it without a guide, but every single day I'm looking for my next chance to play it. My partner and I are playing it together. But I'm also playing Flip Flop Solitaire, which is an amazing variant of Solitaire made by Zach Gage for mobile. And before that, I was very, very into Tetris Effect. I still very much want to unlock everything in Tetris Effect and get really good at it. So that's kind of my mastery game right now.
I still haven't played Obra Dinn yet, but it is definitely on my list to check out.
Oh yeah, I've been on my list for months, and I'm finally getting around to it. And I was worried I had too high expectations, but no, it's very gripping.
Now, getting back to Kitfox and with Boyfriend Dungeon, there's definitely a lot to talk about. And for people watching us live right now, I can tell you this is not going to be one of our extra long casts because Tanya is at work, so I don't want to keep her too busy tonight. So I know Mojo is watching in chat. He's gotten used to the fact that we can have like 2 to 3 hour long casts like it's nothing. Sometimes the guest runs out of air, but usually it's I run out of voice by the time we get done. So we're going to try to keep things relatively on track tonight. So let's jump into Boyfriend Dungeon, because again, I think that can easily take up 40 minutes, probably even more than that, if we really get down to it.
Well, it's taking up years of my life, so I certainly hope so.
Now, as you said a few minutes ago, the original idea, you originally started working on Boyfriend Dungeon about 2 years ago, is that right?
About a year and a half, right? Well, a year and 9 months, yeah.
Okay. So, for people watching us right now, live or recorded, who haven't heard of the game, what is the elevator pitch for Boyfriend Dungeon?
Boyfriend Dungeon is a game about dungeon crawling in the modern world, but also when you find armor, you find loot, you fight monsters. But when you find weapons, they can turn into beautiful people who you take on dates in order to level them up and find love. So it's part dungeon crawler, part dating simulator.
And for myself, I am very versed when it comes to the dungeon crawling side. Not so much when it comes to the dating simulator side, and that is certainly a very interesting combination of design. Let me see, we got a comment here.
Thank you.
Oh, he's talking about we were playing another game on stream by the name of Dagger. I don't know.
Oh.
I was trying out this game called Knife Sisters. It's kind of like a visual novel game Very interesting. Again, visual novel and the dating sim aren't exactly genres that I'm too familiar with, or I prefer more the gameplay point of view. So it's very interesting to look at Boyfriend Dungeon kind of being like this amalgamation of these two different designs. So where did like the idea for the game come from?
Well, I mean, some dating simulators do have a good amount of gameplay. A lot of the gameplay ends up being choices about how you spend your time or what skills you build up or that kind of thing. But I also am not, well, at least before this project, I was not as conversant in visual novels either because although I love reading and I read books every night, I still, don't want to read a book on my computer usually. I don't even have an e-reader.
Yeah, me neither.
And so I don't know. So part of it was like feeling restless when I play visual novels, and part of it was feeling like, in dungeon crawlers it's a little bit boring when I don't have that narrative element. But part of it is also that the few games that had combined those two halves of like combat and relationships, like I don't know, even let's say BioWare games, like they have some options, but I guess I still felt slightly off center. I still felt like for a lot of these games, I don't know, they take themselves really seriously, a lot. Like maybe I want something a little bit more lighthearted, but B, I don't know, I wanted to be able to just date everybody and have it not be a big deal. And I think one of the main goals was actually to challenge this whole, like, pick one person to love forever. Like, why can't I just have a whole variety of weapons? I don't know.
And it's very interesting when we talk about romance in video games. That's probably another podcast topic in of itself. And as you said, Tanya, like, for a lot of video games that go for romance, especially when we look at the AAA side, it does feel very linear. It feels very much like you pick someone and then everything just kind of like goes along those lines. And again, for people watching me, I am definitely not exactly the expert on romance and dating either. So I guess when it came to Boyfriend Dungeon and kind of designing around basically being able to date anyone that you wanted, I guess what was kind of like how does that fit into things from a gameplay perspective? Of course, you mentioned that you get weapons, they can turn into people. So for people watching us right now, how does the narrative and the gameplay kind of intersect?
Well, you do have two different options when you go into town. So it's set in Verona Beach, California, where you're new to town, you have a summer job of clearing monsters from dungeons. And so it is kind of up to you every day, like, do I go into the dungeon and kill some monsters? And if so, you have to call up a weapon and see if they want to go kill monsters with you. Or you can go on a date with anybody who's invited you on a date. And so it is sort of like there are these two halves of the game. You have the combat side and the dating side. The way they interplay is that, of course, the more comfortable and that your weapon is with you, the more time you spent together, the more you like each other. Whether or not it's romantic, because that's up to you. You don't have to date everybody. You can also just be friends with them. Then the better you fight together, and the more you have new abilities together, and you can do more damage. And I think one of the challenges that we found is supporting people who do just want to pick their one true love. And if they do just want to, date the dagger, how do you allow that, but then also allow other people to date all the different weapons without one or the other feeling repetitive or short, or I don't know, like a shortcut or that kind of thing. It's been a challenge for sure.
And coming from chat, yes, they did have a successful Kickstarter, and we'll be talking more about that probably in our next section. But another major aspect of Boyfriend Dungeon, obviously, is the fact that it is built around very much a diverse group of people. I know the game has suddenly gotten a lot of interest from the LGBTQ community, and this is one of those things that we've been seeing more of, especially from the independent space, with trying to be more inclusive to people. So I think I know the answer to this one already, but I'm assuming that from the get-go, Boyfriend Dungeon was really aimed at being as inclusive as possible.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of it was, like I mentioned before, I felt like when I played some games that it assumed I was a male, first of all, and that was very important, or not, to the storyline, but it still would force me to play a male character, or it would force me to only date the lady characters, or it would assume that I probably only want to date the lady characters, or something like that. And that became increasingly aggravating. And then I thought to myself that if that's aggravating for me, you know, as a white, able-bodied young woman, then I imagine it's super aggravating for a lot of other people. And of course, I can't speak for everybody else. I can only speak for myself, but it definitely became a situation where, as I was walking down this road of how do I make a game that appeals to me and people like me, of, well, why can't we also look at how not to make it aggravating for everybody else as well? And of course, you can't make everything to all people, but I think you can also put some work into not making your art explicitly alienating either.
And we're definitely, and again, this is another really good topic we could explore at a future time, but we are seeing definitely more of that push, especially in the AAA market, with people asking and criticizing developers who, as you said, Tanya, who assume that everybody who plays a game wants to have a hetero relationship, or everybody who's playing the game is just, you know, the 18 to 30 straight white male demographic. I think this was either last year or the year before that Nintendo did get some pushback. I think it was from either Animal Crossing or one of their kind of like life sim games for, again, only assuming that people are just want to have hetero relationships.
And it can be very complicated between international cultures as well, of course. And the truth is that it is interesting to see as the different cultures interact, different values that end up getting projected into their art. Yeah, it depends who you are and what you're making your game for, I guess, because it's difficult now. You're releasing it to a global market, and that can mean that some people will get upset kind of no matter what you do.
Yeah. That is certainly true, and we can certainly go into examples of that if we wanted to.
Yeah, because for every example of somebody being criticized for being conservative, there's also some people out there ready to criticize for being progressive, for sure.
Now, taking this back to Boyfriend Dungeon, from the gameplay perspective, as we said, it does feature dungeon crawling. I'm assuming that the dungeon crawling itself, is that procedurally built?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of, I guess, the roguelike design then, what kind of focus are you planning for Boyfriend Dungeon? Is it going to be like a very challenging, very skill-intensive one? Will it be more on the later side? I guess, where do you think the game falls?
So, by default, I think somebody who's looking for a super challenge will have some optional challenges they can look into. The game as a whole should be fun to play, which means it has to be challenging at a basic level. But it's not supposed to be the Dark Souls of dating sims. As much as I'd love to play that, that's not.
That could be a really good tagline, though.
Yeah, I guess that'll have to be my next game. But I mean, we'll have a couple of difficulty modes for sure. But I think people who pick up Boyfriend Dungeon aren't looking for the hardest game in the world. They're also not looking to waste their time, but we're definitely going to have to balance people who have maybe never even played a dungeon game before with people who are looking for a really good boss fight,
Yeah, but that can be very difficult. I mean, this goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago with how Kitfox has been trying to define themselves as combining both gameplay and narrative together. Because as you said, there's always that balance you have to be careful of when it comes to focusing too much on the story or too much on the gameplay. As you said, if it's too hardcore dungeon crawling, then the story side, people who just want to be there for the dating sim, are going to feel neglected or they're going to feel punished. If it's too much on the dating side, then people are going to wonder what's the whole point of the dungeon crawling then.
Yeah, and I mean, I think in a perfect world, we would actually combine the two. Like, that's something that was lovely about Shrouded Isle. John Woo's design, he's actually giving, I'm probably not supposed to say anything, but between us, he's talking at the Game Developers Conference about ludo-narrative congruence, and it's like the two can't be separated in that game. The narrative is the gameplay.
Yep.
And that's not the case in Boyfriend Engine. Boyfriend Engine, they are kind of two different modes, and I think in an ideal world, we would figure out how to, I don't know, smooch your actual weapon while you're fighting with it. Maybe that's the VR mode, I don't know. But it's a different question. I saw that Pray for Mojo asked if it was fast-paced or slow, and it is pretty fast-paced. So we have to be careful for it not to be just mashing, but also that you don't die instantly with all the bullets coming in and the monsters attacking you and all that stuff.
And yeah, going back to what you were just saying regarding like Shatter Isle, I thought that was a very interesting game, especially from the challenge side of things. Because a lot of that game was kind of like a fail as you go and then learn from that. And looking at something like Boyfriend Dungeon, it doesn't seem like that kind of philosophy could really apply with like the kind of the market you're aiming for.
No, it's definitely, I mean, you will die in the dungeons for sure. You'll get as far as you can and then, you know, use that experience to level up and maybe learn something, but it's definitely not, I mean, Shrouded Isle was pretty harsh for sure. And you should definitely keep an eye out in January, which is our current plan for when we're announcing Jongwoo's next game, which will also be very difficult, I think, but in a completely different way. But yeah, interesting narrative systems for sure.
And another roguelike design-related question for you, Tanya. As we said a few minutes ago, one of the first games from Kitfox was Shattered Planet, and that was kind of like your studio's first real take on the roguelike formula. I think I played that one as well, and
thank you.
As we've seen, roguelike design is a very interesting title. Again, each one of the things that we talk about is probably an hour in of itself. And I guess from a designer perspective, how has like your own sense of philosophy when it comes to roguelikes have changed going from Shattered Planet to where the studio is at now with Boyfriend Dungeon?
Well, I think that the reason why roguelikes and roguelites have been so popular since 2014 is that they have a lot of different benefits to offer designers. They offer higher replayability, they offer scaling difficulty, they offer different potential structures for progression, both on the mastery side and in the statistical RPG side. For us, I think that's reflected in the fact that the way we've used roguelike features in our different games has been so different. Shattered Planet was very traditional in its turn-basedness, but we wanted to look into a stronger progression, a longer form game on top of it, kind of almost like a Rogue Legacy approach. And then Moon Hunters, we really toned down the amount of failure sort of expected, but we amped up the features that were more multiplayer friendly, so the more like class-based progression and things like that, abilities that would synergize well together. Meanwhile, Boyfriend Engine in some ways has stripped down the roguelike in a lot of ways because we don't need it to have the 90% of the game in the dungeons. That's only 50% of the game, and so we don't need, you know, mystery potions necessarily. We don't need all the progression to be in there. We have progression and we have items and economy and stuff outside the dungeon, so the dungeon can just focus on generating the combat challenges, which means in some ways it's the most traditional of all the dungeons we made so far, but that lets us innovate in other ways.
Let me see. BCW asks, since the game is half of a dungeon crawler, will there be multiple endings?
There are multiple endings. I can't say more than that right now, or my Kickstarter backers will be very upset.
All right. Now, switching gears from the dungeon crawling side, actually, before we do that, are there any aspects of the roguelike or dungeon side of Boyfriend Dungeon that we haven't discussed yet that you'd like to bring up now, Tanya?
Well, something that's interesting to me when I've been designing roguelikes in all the games in the past has been how you handle the authored content. And For Shattered Planet, it was very, very minimal. There would be these one-tile encounters that would be like a little choice that you would find that was randomly scattered out there, and the rest was completely generated, like a cellular automata. Moon Hunters, on the other hand, we hand-authored every single chunk that existed. So it would have some dynamic elements, like enemy spawners could be, you know, from 3 to 5 small enemies from this pool and 1 to 2 big enemies from this pool. But at the end of the day, like, we placed the rocks and we placed the mushrooms, and it was fairly hand built, actually. And then the generator just strung them together. And for Boyfriend Dungeon, we're going back to more generated. So there's less being hand authored in each individual little chunk, more random objects and random enemies and random challenges happening. But we're also introducing some hand-authored rooms that are romantic hangouts. So, for example, if you're in the mall dungeon, you might come across the ice skating rink, and then you and your weapon can say, hey, do you want to go ice skating together for a few minutes? And then you have a little, like, completely authored date in there. And I guess the reason I bring it up is that it's interesting trying to balance how much you have to build as a designer by hand and how much you have to program getting them all to string together correctly so that it actually feels different every time.
Yeah, and that kind of balance, especially when it comes to having like those hard-coded elements in a roguelike, can be very tough, because we've played roguelikes in the past that feature a lot more on the hard-coded side, and while it may have more of a defined experience or a balanced one, but they don't end up being that replayable. And then, as people who've watched me before know, I have played my fair share of just completely crazy roguelikes where anything can happen, and while it can certainly be a lot more exciting, it's also a lot harder from a design point of view to get that all balanced, to make sure that, yes, it's completely random, but we still have, you know, we still have to make sure that the player can beat this game.
Yeah, that it's achievable, that it's comprehensible, that it's understandable. If you're a designer who's interested in this kind of question, I do want to say that I co-edited a book on procedural generation that came out in 2017 called Procedural Generation in Game Design, which has many, many articles by various designers. Also, coming next year in March, I'm co-editing again with Taryn Adams of Dwarf Fortress. We're co-editing procedural storytelling in game design, so keep an eye out for that one.
Nice. And for your audience watching me, I also have my own book that just came out in November as well.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. It's called 20 Essential Games to Study, and it looks at 20 games over the last 30 years with unique or interesting game design that anyone who's interested in kind of expanding their own knowledge on gameplay to look at. And I'm actually working on a second book as well too. We're both doing that on top of everything else we're doing.
Yeah. It's hard to avoid. I mean, you write all this stuff and then you want people to learn from it, you know?
Oh, and BCW, yes, you feel free to ask multiple questions as well. But I'll get to your question in a second. The second book I'm working on is kind of looking at the design of jumping and platforming design. So it's going to be a busy time for, I think, everybody here.
There's a lot of jumping, yeah.
Now, before we... I do have some questions regarding the dating side of Boyfriend Dungeon, but BCW also asked, does everyone have the same kind of dates?
So his example is actually, or their example, sorry, is very appropriate. Sunder and Rowan will both have ice skating dates, yes. So for example, if you come across an ice skating rink, depending on which weapon you're wielding, then you'll go on a date with that person. It'll be a little mini hangout, we call it. And of course, different people have different opinions of ice skating, for example. Some people are good at it, some people are not.
Like me.
Yeah, me neither. But it's a chance to learn a little bit of something about your weapon partner that you might not normally see in the main plot.
And speaking about learning about your partner, I think that's a good segue into talking again about the other half of Boyfriend Dungeon. That is, of course, the dating side. And hi, Red, thanks for coming on. So, as we've said, Boyfriend Dungeon is only half a dungeon crawler, and the other half is, of course, dating your weapons, hanging out with them, and that kind of design. And as we said about like 10-15 minutes ago, this is not a genre that I'm particularly versed in. And I want to ask you about this, Tanya. Like, what attracted you to attracted you to the visual novel design, and kind of wanting that to be the other half of the gameplay loop?
Well, honestly, it grew out of wondering, how do you grow closer to someone? And the way you grow closer to someone is you get to know them. And so if I could take 5 years to prototype an AI that I could have people go on dates with, that'd be great. But I can't. So I especially like the fact that if I write a few different dates, they can have very, very different flavors, they can have very, very different tones. Like, you really feel like you get to know these different characters, and that they respond to you and they remember things that you say, in a way that building an AI or a dynamic system that would do that would be extremely difficult. But hey, you know, if Boyfriend Engine sells 1 million copies, maybe I can blow that all on a R&D budget for a romance robot. Although, I mean, people who have been paying very close attention can actually, I'm going to put a link in the chat here. If you go to mixer.com/badcupid or badcupidgame.com, we actually are working on a generative flirting grammar where random characters are picked from a database and they flirt with each other. So that sort of came out of this joke of thinking about how could you generate romance, but it ends up being comedy rather than anything actually emotional.
And here's a question I'm interested in. Again, when it comes to visual novel design, like I said, like for myself, I know for a lot of people, like we don't really see the depth there. And as you said, there is depth and complexity to the genre. So my question then for you, Tanya, is like, in your opinion, like what makes a good visual novel or dating sim game? Like, what is the attraction, I guess no pun intended, for people who enjoy that kind of gameplay?
I mean, I think, of course, it always depends on the person. There's lots of different types. It's a varied landscape out there. But for me personally, as a designer, I find that visual novels need good writing so that the people you talk to in the game actually feel like actual characters that you want to get to know. They might even fool you into thinking they're real people briefly. But I think a lot of it is the fantasy of having the option to say the right thing at the right time, or to say the funny thing that you think of afterwards. In real life, when we're in conversations, we don't think of the sexiest thing to say, or we don't think of the funniest thing to say all the time. And yet, I think that's part of why we watch, movies with romantic elements and something, is because that's the love story we wish that would happen to us. And so I think that dating sims and visual novels, a lot of it is about giving that kind of fantasy, but interactive. So you can really feel like I made the choices that made this person fall in love with me. And that's a really nice feeling, especially when you're attached to that character as well. And it's not just necessarily about saying the right things at the right time. It's about them noticing, oh, you're a really kind person, or oh, you're a really gentle person, or oh, you're a fiery go-getter, and having it feel like the game recognizes you and admires you for what's special about you is a unique feeling, I think.
Mm-hmm. And we have seen some evolution in terms of the visual novel design over the last few years. I remember, like, one of the earlier examples was, I think, Analog, A Hate Story, which that was more of like an investigation kind of gameplay. You didn't really control things from a dialogue point of view.
That's true.
And then we've certainly seen more, I think, lately, like the game we were showing on stream a few days ago. I know there's other examples where there's a lot more variance. I know, what was it, Lady Killer in a Bind by Christina Law. I know that one was very popular. I think that was last year, or was that early this year? I always get the years confused.
Oh, I think it's been over a year since Lady Killer came out. But yeah, Christine Love is actually also consulting on the structure of Boyfriend Engine, because she's a master, or a mistress, I guess, of being able to have dating sim elements structured in other kinds of gameplay as well.
Now, here's kind of a, I'm not sure this would be a tangent or just kind of like a curious thought for myself. When it comes to like creating like the variants in terms of dialogue, how much work really goes into, I guess, coming up with like all the various different options in terms of like the dialogue trees and such?
Well, that's actually less of the job than you think. If anything, it's more like cutting it down to only 3 or 4 options is the hard thing, because I mean, when somebody having this other character talking to you and having it feel like the right moment that you want to say something is step one. But once you already have like, for example, the character asks you a question about how things are going, making sure that that question is actually interesting, that has multiple interesting answers, that the player would feel comfortable selecting. So that part, like, let's assume that you get through and you make a draft of a short date that has all those elements. The really hard part is editing. I mean, even novelists say that the bulk of a writer's work is in editing, and it's even more the case in interactive, I think, because in interactive, you change one thing and it's a train wreck of potential colliding parallel universes. So it is a little bit of a puppet master show to remember all the variables that you're trying to track. Like, one of the characters early on notices if you really like chocolate, for example, and then remembering to bring that up in a way that's graceful and feels special or thoughtful is something I want that character to do later in their plotline. But that means I have to keep it in mind, and along with all the other variables about, I don't know, spiritual beliefs and do they want to be romantic, and do they want to have they kissed yet, and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and that's a really good point. It's one of the more challenging aspects when it comes to storytelling in video games. We especially have seen this with what's happened with like Telltale Games and kind of the growth of their storytelling formula, and how a lot of it, again, what people, fans of game wisdom, we always show about that, they will remember it. That doesn't really apply to anything. But when you're trying to do something from like a visual novel, when you're trying to have those intimate conversations and character growth, they do have to remember it, and you have to figure out a way to implement that's both, standard that works with the game design and also works from a storytelling point of view.
Yeah, I mean, the trick is, I guess, if you can just have your character seem to remember one small thing that the player thought they wouldn't, then you've kind of started the illusion that maybe the game is tracking 15 other things. Now, in reality, it is tracking 15 other things. It's just you didn't, like, it didn't have a real good way of expressing that it was tracking those 15 other things. And that's why she will remember this is a really clever telegraph. But I think by focusing on the extrinsic reminder of that systemic interaction, it takes away from the intrinsic, the potential illusion that, no, this is a real person. It is possible that they'll remember everything and really love me,
Yeah. And trying to get that illusion to the player can be very difficult, because once you lose that in a game, it's kind of gone forever. And we've seen that with a lot of storytelling or even just gameplay titles that, like, once a player understands that, this person really isn't scared, or if I just stand here, nothing will hurt me, it doesn't start happening until the trigger happens, the suspension of disbelief is over.
Well, and part of that, I mean, it is about being a game designer, and it's hard sometimes to remember that not everybody else is a designer and has studied all these design tricks, and they're still coming to it like a fresh player who wants to be fooled. They're ready to buy into the illusion, but it's difficult because I do feel like customers or players are getting more savvy about some systems. Like roguelikes is a really good example of things where players are starting to see the tells of, oh, this is a random potion, or there's a boss fight coming up because there's this sign and this sign and this sign and this sign, and definitely there's a boss around the corner. And it's almost like the basic player is learning a little bit of game and system design, whether or not they notice it. It's just becoming an intuitive sense.
Now, one question that I have for you, Tanya, regarding the various characters in Boyfriend Dungeon. As we've said, the people that you can date are tied to the weapons that you pick up in the dungeons. So again, this I think goes back to what you were saying earlier regarding that combination of narrative and gameplay into one. When it came to Boyfriend Dungeon, did you come up with the characters first, or did you think about what weapons you wanted the player to use and then kind of work it from that angle?
Both actually. It depended on the characters. Some of them started as humans, and I tried to figure out if there was a weapon that would work for them. Some of them, I looked at the weapon lineup and I thought, we really should have a hammer, because that would be a good weapon. Now, who would be a hammer? And so it really depended. It was very much about the entire player experience. I'll say that dagger was simultaneously both. Like, I don't know what it is about knife sisters or whatever. There's something about women and small knives that I guess it's an inherent thing we haven't realized in our culture. It's under the surface. But she came in fully formed. I was like, yeah, there's a woman with secrets, and she's the dagger for sure. Whereas the dancing, well, it started as a scimitar and turned into a talwar when I decided he was Indian. But that almost started as a joke because the dancing scimitar is such a classic like D&D thing. Then I was like, okay, so there's a sword that hangs out at the nightclub. Yeah, the other ones, it really depended on whether I knew I wanted a K-pop idol. I knew that I wanted an FA, but I didn't know how all the humans and the weapon forms would interlock until I kind of made a grid for myself and tried to make it all fit together.
All right. Now, in terms of the visual novel side, as we said earlier, some visual novel games or dating games allow you to have like the various stats, and that determines kind of like how the story plays out, what options you have available. Does that exist in Boyfriend Dungeon in any capacity?
So far, we've actually backed away from using stats in the dating segment and instead made it so that it's more about how much you've spent time together, like how much you've wielded this weapon at the dungeon. Depends on how fond they are of you. And that's because we implemented having stat-based dialogue. So, for example, if you picked the aggressive option, you would get +1 attack, or if you picked the shy option, you get +1 defense, or the opposite, that if you had a high attack, you'd be more successful with your aggressive flirts or that kind of thing. But we ended up seeing that that made people disconnect from the characters as being people. It stopped being so expressive, because what would happen was that people would get into the dialogues, and instead of they'd want to pick one option because it was funny or it was what they'd really want to pick. They want to pick the shy one because that's how they feel. But they'd feel this pressure to pick the other one, either because they knew that was their stat build, or they knew that was a better stat they wanted, or whatever. And having that friction there of really wanting to pick this one, but feel like the game is telling them to pick this one, it could have been an interesting decision. On paper, it was an interesting decision because, you have all these different motivations. But in practice, it was very unpleasant. People reported that they just felt like the game was punishing them for picking the option that they wanted, and they weren't able to play it the way they wanted to. So we've actually stripped back a lot of the stat-related stuff. You'll still get stat bonuses occasionally on dates, but we've changed it so it's more like based on who you date, that has an impact on how you grow as a person. So dating the character that's more precise and more calculated will increase your precision, for example. Whereas dating the character that's a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more chaotic, will increase your attack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting design conversation regarding, again, when you start throwing in like min-max opportunities, especially how they relate to storytelling. Because I know for a lot of people, including myself, that when we start getting really into the gameplay side of things, that we will try to manipulate things along those lines, even if it comes at the cost of storytelling.
Yeah.
And it's always that, because there's always that temptation there of, yes, this may be the option I want, but, +2 attack, I mean, that could come back and help me, 5 hours in at X boss fight.
Yeah, and I really didn't want to punish people for expressing themselves. I think at the end of the day, the fantasy of being able to express yourself and have all these people love you, like that was the core of the game. Whereas being the most masterful min-maxer of dungeons, like there's other games for that if you want that.
And a quick question for you regarding that, I guess just a clarification for me. In terms of getting the stat bonuses from the weapons, does it work based on like the weapon you take into the dungeon, or is it based on like whatever, I guess, dating ranks you have for each character?
So there's two different things happening. Okay. One, the weapon that you take in has their own bonuses and attack types and abilities and things like that. So that is a kind of a major thing. That's your major piece of equipment.
Okay.
But also, when you go on dates, it's likely, for example, so FA teaches you fencing. Like he literally takes you on lessons because he does FA as a hobby. He will increase your attack sometimes if you go train your fencing with him. And that applies regardless. It's just +1 attack for the rest of your life. So those are two different bonuses. But yes, all melee weapons, mojo.
And I gotta ask, why, I guess, obviously with all the weapons are people, was there ever the idea of having, like, armor or other pieces of gear be characters, or was that, like, kind of out of scope?
Currently, we're only focusing on weapons. That is an interesting idea for a sequel, though. I guess we could have the poly armory or whatever. But I should get going and get back to work.
All right, yep, I can see we are coming up. So, if you wouldn't mind, I guess we'll move on to like our final quick set of questions. I just want to talk a little bit more about the Kickstarter. I know for people watching us live or recorded that Victoria, she did a post on Gamma Sutra talking more about the success and the work that went into it. If you wouldn't mind linking that to me or put it in chat, that way people can, that will probably answer a lot of questions we have about things from a Kickstarter point of view.
I mean, to be clear, which I think it's well said in the article, but I was the strategist, and Victoria did an amazing job executing on that strategy. Oh, I'm not finding.
I know it's tough to find some like specific things on Gamma Sutra. I've had that in the past. If you want, just link that to me, like on Twitter or an email, I can include that in the description when this goes up.
Sure.
But I guess very quickly then, I just have a few just general questions regarding the Kickstarter, then we'll just go into our final set. And for people watching us right now, I figure we'll spend maybe another 5 to 10 minutes thereabout. If you have any final questions for Tanya regarding Boyfriend Dungeon or the Kickstarter, please get them in now. I'll also make that available. Exactly. And this will be last call for questions. So, when it came to the Kickstarter, and again, congratulations on that as well, for you and the rest of Kitfox.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, I know you've done Kickstarters before. I know, I think Shatter Planet was one. I don't remember if Shelter Isle was a Kickstarter or not. But,
no.
Okay. In terms of like approaching things from a Kickstarter point of view, like this is just a question I think more for people watching this who are interested in going to Kickstarter. I guess, what were some, I guess, the essential elements that you felt kind of went into Boyfriend Dungeon from a Kickstarter point of view?
I think the fact that we built up our audience for 9 months beforehand was definitely one of the biggest contributing factors. So we announced Boyfriend Dungeon in November or maybe late October of 2017, and then we didn't kickstart it until August 2018. So we had the intervening 9-10 months to grow our newsletter, to have a Steam Coming Soon page, to have our Twitter followers know about the game. And that's definitely the number one question that I see people asking, like, how long should I or how do I promote my Kickstarter? And it's like, well, you should have been promoting your game long before the Kickstarter, because nobody's excited about the Kickstarter. Everyone's excited about your game. But I think the other thing that I always tell people is it's very tempting to only study successful Kickstarters. People ask to talk to the successful Kickstarters. They talk about it all the time. It's at the top of the news. Even Kickstarter.com itself will promote successful Kickstarters to you when you try to search for things. But as a PR strategist, as a business strategist, as a game designer, I find it's equally helpful to look at the unsuccessful Kickstarters that are similar to your game. So I spent a lot of time actually looking through various games and Kickstarters and things that were unsuccessful, that were not funded, that did not sell very well, and tried to learn from those as well, because they had different lessons to teach.
Yeah, and it's the same thing that I do with examining video games as well. You can't just look at, the top 5 best-selling games. You have to look at the ones that didn't do so well, because there are lessons to be learned, in all avenues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think survivorship bias is a really big factor in, well, especially business, but indie business in particular. I think that survivorship bias runs pretty rampant.
Yeah. And a few questions from chat. Hamstrong Harry asks, will there be a Boyfriend Dungeon anime?
Well, you never know. I mean, we're going to have those animated transformation animations for each weapon, so maybe that'll inspire Cartoon Network to give us millions of dollars or something. And then someone else wanted to know about the people of Verona Beach, with side quests, getting to know them. And there will be ways to wander Verona Beach and encounter randos. I don't think I wouldn't go as far as saying side quests, but you will have free time, let's say. And the dev team is not all female. Our lead programmer is a man.
And one question I wanted to definitely bring up on the cast, and again, we could sit here and talk for like 2 more hours, because I'm just getting ready. People know me, but I know you have to get going, so I'm trying to resist all these questions. But one thing I definitely want to ask you about, because this is another major part of the Kickstarter, is the fact that you had a final total in terms of the stretch goals at 200,000. I know you guys raised successfully. Again, congratulations, 272,000 for the game. And there's definitely that temptation, I think, from developers to just keep adding stretch goals, keep adding more promises. And I just want to get your thoughts on this, Tanya. Again, with your background understanding of PR, what was the decision to stop the game or stop the stretch goals at that level, where theoretically, as with a lot of developers, you could have just kept adding more to it?
Well, honestly, before the Kickstarter started, I kind of said, this is my ideal. In my ideal world, this is what the game would be. And then I stripped it back as far as I could to what could I tolerate the game being? What's the absolute minimum that I would accept for Boyfriend Dungeon? And that minimum was what we originally put on Kickstarter as the game. But everything else in the stretch goal was leading up to my ideal. And I think that's the trick, is that most designers, especially when it comes to potentially infinite money, are happy to add more to their ideal. Whereas I think if we're honest with ourselves, the ideal still isn't everything in the kitchen sink. It is a very particular focused experience that you wanted to create. And adding more to it doesn't add value. It might add production hours, it might add, I don't know, cost, but that doesn't mean that the player will get much more out of it, because at that point you've built what you were trying to achieve.
Yep, I mean, we could certainly name some examples of developers who went that route, just adding more and more, and just kind of obscuring what was the whole point of playing that game to begin with. And again, that can be a topic for another day. So. Again, I'm resisting the temptation to ask you 15 more questions, Tanya. So, so let's go to wrap things up. So, to end things here, for people wondering, do you have a tentative release date for Boyfriend Dungeon?
Well, in the Kickstarter, we said 2019. That was the only information we gave. I don't really have more information on that yet. Hopefully, in a few months, I can be a little bit more specific, but I don't want to get myself in trouble because I've done that in the past many times. I do hope people can subscribe to our newsletter or join the Kitfox Games Discord if they are interested. You should also keep an eye on the Kinda Funny Games Showcase on Saturday, because there is going to be an interesting Kitfox Games announcement or content included there.
And in terms of platforms, I'm assuming I know it's going to be on Steam. Are you aiming for any other platforms for the game?
I'm not allowed to say that either. Sorry.
All right. So then again, second to last question then, anything else relating to Boyfriend Dungeon that we didn't touch on that, you would like to announce now or just like let people know about?
No, I think it's so one thing that might not be clear is if you join our Discord, Victoria and I actually visit the Discord every day. So if you have suggestions or excitements, or you just want to get inside news as we do in progress things, and maybe you don't have email. Oh yeah, one thing I should mention. So first, join the Discord if you're interested in that kind of thing. But also, the newsletters every month are actually written in the voice. Like, they're written as love letters from the characters of Boyfriend Dungeon. So this month, coming out probably on Thursday actually, is a newsletter from the Scythe, Rowan. Rowan will be writing the Kitfox newsletter on Thursday. So if you're interested in getting to know the characters a little bit more, definitely check those out.
All right. So then, I guess for now, my final question for you, Tanya, is do you have any final thoughts or anything you'd like to say to the fans to end this cast on?
Just thank you very much for playing games, and I hope our games will keep getting more fun for you.
All right. All right, great. If you wouldn't mind hanging on Skype for like 20 seconds after we end the stream, I just have a few wrap-up questions for you off recording. But other than that, we are going to end things here for tonight. So, Tanya, again, it was a pleasure hanging out with you and catching up. And best of luck with the rest of Boyfriend Dungeon.
Thank you.
All right. And for people watching us either live or recorded right now, thank you so much for coming out. We have our own Discord channel linked down below, as well as a link to my first book. And at a time when you get a chance, if you want to send over the link to your book, I'll include that in the description as well. And we have our own Patreon. If you donate, you can get access to this talk early and ad-free. But that is going to do it for tonight. That there for you. So everybody watching, thank you so much for coming out. Be sure to check back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. Until our next stream, have a great night and take care.